Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Meliani Priska Basanunggu. My official number A1M2 19094. Now I will explain about the title is Synchronic Psycholinguistic II Macrostructure. 7.1 is Effect to Motivational States upon decoding. 7.1.1 is Learning Theories Proposition. 7.1.1.1 is Energizing Effect. One of the basic principles of Hall-type learning theory is that drive combines multiplicatively with the strength to yield reaction potential in symbolic terms is SER, something is HR, XD. Science is the excitatory potential association stimulus with responses SER that is directly complete with behavioral indicate these theories. This means that the amount of the drive associated with the response tendency, for example, on either decoding and or encoding sides, will directly influence the probability, latency, and so forth of the behavior concerned. If the learned habit strength association stimulus with response as a age of alternative decoding or encoding reaction are near the maxima and hence are roughly equal strengths, it can be seen the motivational variables will become very important in the determining what reaction occurred. This condition is probably typical of most ordinary language behavior and hence momentary fluctuation in the motivation attitude of speaker and hearers sets of the kind of another interest in one of another aspect of the message of and so forth will be significant and interesting both decoding and encoding activities of communicators. The postulates multiplicative relation between habit strength and drive has one very significant corollary if two or more alternatives respond to the same stimulus. For example, a divergent hierarchy have different habit strength. The effect of increasing generalized drive will to be further increased to difference between the two reaction potential. In the other words, the effect of increases generalized drive upon habit family hierarchy will be to further augment the probability of the dominant response and relatively damp the probabilities of the weaker reaction tendencies. This has important implications for language behavior under stress conditions. 7.1.1.2 is Q effect. To this point, we have been speaking only of the Q effect of specific drive, for example, drive states previously and differentially associated with particular reaction. What should be the Q effect of generalized drive, for example, drive state not previously and differentially associated with particular reaction? Since the effect of any flood of novel stimulation is to change the patterns eliciting specific reaction. For example, it shifts the momentary patterns along generalization continues away from the point of maximal habit strength. The effect of non-specific drive shall be to weaken existing habits, since weaker members of responses hierarchies, which are nearer the reaction threshold anyways, will trend the eliminated in this fashion the Q effect of non-specific drive, just like in the engaging effect above, will be relatively augment the probability of the occurrence dominant response. 7.1.1.3 is language habits, family hierarchies suspensible to the motivational effect. Referring back to the general learning theories, models of decoding and accounting process developed in section 6.1, there are at least 4 places the which hierarchies suspensible to motivational effect are found. Number 1 is semantic decoding. Since all signs are to some extent multi-significance homonyms, being only the extreme case, varying in the intensity of the generalized drives shall tend to channel prevention and significance into more stereotype modes. The varying specific motivational states shall operate selectively to change the probabilities of the particular alternative significance or ways of perceiving. Number 2 is anticipational decoding. Given varying histories of contiguity and redundancy of what's follow what, in both linguistic and provincial recordings, to central sensory representation of attention's event will be differentially associated with hierarchies of subsequent central sensory events, usually as predictive rather than adjunctively. For example, turning up, increasing the level of generalized drafts. For example, decoding under anxiety should operate to stereotype. This impute increasing mechanism will producing errors. Increasing in specific drive associated with specific decoding sequences should simple stabilize such sequences offering resistance to external disturbations. For example, the greater the interest in a particular musical instrument, the better one will follow in line through a complex selection. Whether specific motivation occur upon anticipational and dispositional spatial mechanisms, the feedback from the semantic system would be difficult at ascertain. 7.1.2 Part of research proposal and prediction. 7.1.2.1 is title is Decoding Operational and Motivation. A. Generalizes the earlier in this report section 5.4 association techniques were described for building up message material having either a high or low traditional probabilities for a particular communication of people. If one group of subjects from these communicates were caused to be under general high drive level and another under low drive level, and both were given the task of reading or listening to both high and low traditional sequencing materials, we would predict the significant interaction between these two variables. The high drive level subject shall be relatively much poorer and compressional relation. On the low traditional probably material and relatively better on the high tradition more probability material. For example, the speed of the high drive level ground and two materials shall be significantly greater. There are many possible ways to experiment induce differential drive levels unpredictably such might be used to punishment for intelligence tests. and even making them extremely hungry, thirsty, and angry. It will also be possible to select two extreme groups on the Tyler Manifest Executive scale, assuming the high-scoring subject to be under generally high number other situation. B is specific AST. Many of the experiments undertaken by Brunner and Postman and their associates on the effect of motivational factor upon preparation are interpretable as effect of the specific motivative state upon the condition. The effect of value system, religious, theoretical, economic, and often as possibly violent, the status cutoff is a change in point, assuming that motivational factor can be disentangled from frequency of the use factors. So called free association of the another standards experimental situation in which specific motivational factor play a part witness the use of this technical and lie detection and the psychotherapy to get the unconscious complexes. The experiments by Foley and Matthew has demonstrated that the association made to the words like administer and binding very appreciably with the amount to professional training in the either law or medicine. In of these cases, however, manipulation of the motive or interest state in the correct terms of the subject selection and frequency of the use variables, therefore, probably are confounded. One can speculate on the possibility, however, of the creating interest of the children animals versus yours. For example, and then presenting message like bear right, the general design here would be to study an association or other increase the counting significant resulting from the presented homonym under motivation. Capitalizing on the difficulties of our young minister about it shall also be possible to study the effect of the differential motivational upon misperception of signs. For example, peers like appraisers and applause under statistical or other experimental condition. Thank you. Maybe that's all for me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Nilam Azahra Junita. My official number is A1M2190998. Okay, I want to explain about effect of motivational state upon encoding. Learning theory proposition. 1. Energizing effect. One of the basic principles of whole type learning theory state that drive combine multiplicatively with habit strength to yield reaction potential. In symbolic terms, SER equals SHR XD. Sign it. The excitatory potential acquisition stimulus with response SER that is directly coupled with behavioral indicators in this theory. This means that the amount of drive associated with a response tendency, example, on their decoding or encoding side will directly influence the probability, latency, and so forth of the behavior concerned. If the learned habit strength associating stimulus with response SHR of alternative decoding or encoding reaction are near their maxima and hence of roughly equal strength, it can be seen that motivational variable will become very important in determining what reaction actually occur. This condition is probably typical of most ordinary language behavior and hence momentary fluctuation in motivation, attitude of speaker and hearer set of one kind or another, interest in one of another aspect of the message of software will be significant in directing both decoding and encoding activity of communicatory. Next, Q effect. The Q effect of specific drives that operate precisely like any other conceptual condition by virtue of having been associated with the elicitation of particular responses. These Q acquire evocative property and contribute to the total electing pattern. Example, they may serve to weigh the stimulus situation in favor of one response rather than another. If the motive state of anger has been associated with swearing responses, subsequent occurrences of this motive state will increase the probability of such responses. If strong fear states were associated with the first childhood language of a bilingual speaker, but not with the second adult language, subsequent fear states should throw the speaker back into his childhood tongue. Less traumatic interplays between motive state, interest, attitude, and the like are presumably operative continuously in the flow of communicating. What we have referred to elsewhere as the intention of speaker reflect the integration of such motive state with semantic state. Next, language habit family hierarchies thus kept table the motivational effect in encoding. 1. Semantic encoding. Semantic state as intention are associated with hierarchies of alternative encoding unit or expression. Again, the effect of increased generalized draft should be to future stereotype semantic encoding, and the effect of increased specific draft should be increase the probability and amplitude stress pitch of those message units associated with such drives that are interest, while decreasing their lengths. Example, tending to move them forward in the message sequence either through choice of alternative construction or if drive is high enough breaking through constructive barriers. And next, dispositional encoding. By virtue of varying degree of contiguity and redundancy between unit in sequential encoding, a tendence scale sequence as centrally responsive will be variably associated with hierarchies of subsequent scale sequence as rarely responsive. These output redundancies in language behavior are particularly concerned with grammatical ordering, affixing, and so on. The effect of generalized drive will be to stereotype the structure of utterance, making the most probably sequence still more probably, and the effect of specific drive, probably indirectly, through selection of semantic item, will be selective among alternative construction those most closely associated with the motive state operative. Next, research proposal and prediction. Encoding operation and motivation. 1. Generalized D. A basic design much like that proposed for decoding can be suggested here. Using the same predetermination of traditional probabilities, noun to verb, adjective to noun, and subject can first become familiar with lists of these words and then use them as the vocabulary for spontaneously encoding short stories, while under either high or low generalized D. Again, it would be predicted that the effort transitional probabilities of sequence spontaneously encoding under high D will be higher than when encoding under relatively low D. Another experimental approach to this problem will be to solicit spontaneous message from high and low D subject and then give systematically multiplied portion of them. Close of the to other group of subjects to be filled in prediction that the material of this subject will yield higher ever fill-in score than the material produced by relatively low this subject. Next, specific SD. As pointed out earlier, it is extremely difficult to think up adequate ways of experimentally manipulating specific motive states such as are presumed to contribute to the selection among alternative semantic and grammatical forms in encoding. Therefore, we may start by indicating in general terms the effect to be expected in the utterance produced by a speaker in a specific motive state, the stress on those units related to example expressing the motive state should be increased, the pitch of those units should be higher, and as a secondary effect, the vowel length should be greater. Here we are referring to non-phonemic stretch, pitch and vowel length, and in language where these message characteristics are phonemic, this effect shall be continued beyond the proudly phonemic elements. All of these effects are attributable to the relation of response amplitude to amount of reaction potential as determined by drive. That's all for me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Novianti Adia Putri. My student registration number is A1M2-19100. I am from Group 7. Synchronic Psycholinguistic II, Macrostructure. I'm gonna talk about meaning. Meanings of meaning. There is a vast literature concerning the subject of meaning, with contribution from the fields of philosophy, theology, literary criticism, linguistics, and psychology. For a key concept, however, the variability in meaning which chameleon-like word is notable. It's not our purpose in this section to review all or even a small part of application of the term meaning in this literature. Rather, we intend only to outline the dimension of a field of denotation within which we believe lie most of the important meanings of meaning found in scientific discourse. Ogden and Richards point out the necessity of an adequate theory of science as a prerequisite for understanding the nature and kinds of meaning. As an approach to consideration of the possibilities in meaning, let us consider the position of the currently dominant trend in American linguistics. Bloomfield defined the meaning of a linguistic form as the situation in which the speaker utters it and the response which it calls forth in a hearer. He continues, the speaker's situation and the hearer's response are closely coordinated thanks to the circumstance that every one of us learned to act indifferently as a speaker or as a hearer. In the causal sequence, speaker's situation to speech to hearer's response, the speaker's situation, as the earlier term, will usually present a simpler aspect than the hearer response. Therefore, we usually discuss and define meanings in terms of a speaker stimulus. Bloomfield further distinguished between the multitudinous, unique, total situation which prompt us to utter any one linguistic form, and the common distinctive semantic features which all of these situations share and which alone have relevance to the linguistic problem. This latter he refers to as distinctive meaning. Situational versus behavioral meaning. Morris' three-way breakdown of sign relation provided a framework for defining three kinds of meaning. The relationship of signs to things signified Morris called destination, and the study of such relationships he called semantics. This presents a theotomy rather than the 2x2 division which would be expected from the two dichotomic linguistic versus extralinguist and situational versus behavioral. Internal versus external loci for meaning. Some of the diversity in definition and uses of the term meaning has been on the issue of the locus assigned to meaning. Some behaviors would refer only to externally observed situation and or response, while others are referring to internal states of the organism, or more specifically to states in a meditation process. This dimension of difference cuts across all of the other dimensions previously described. This trichotomy closely parallels Morris' distinction between denotatum, designatum, and significatum. We need only modify the term class of many or all total contexts as to admit of potential as well as actual situation, or assumed or imagined as well as real situation, or rather to admit of a class as a kind whether or not there exists a real representative of the class. The dimensions of difference in definitions of meaning. The set of four dimensions of difference described above serve quite well as a framework within which to understand many of the definitions and use the term meaning which we have encountered in linguistic, psychological, and philosophical writings. Measurements of connotative meaning. The use of semantic differential as a possible measuring instrument is suggested at several places in this report. For this reason, as well as for strict interest in psycholinguistic, a brief description of this instrument and its possible application is given here. The aspect of meaning to which this measuring device is assumed to provide an index is distinct psychological state of the communicator, which occurs whenever a sign is either presented, decoding, or produced, encoding. The sample of potential bipolar association to a particular concept is provided for the intensity on a 7-step scale. In other words, from the myriad of linguistic and non-linguistic behaviors mediated by semantic states, as a small but carefully devised sample is selected. Okay, that's all the material that I can deliver, and the next material will be presented by my friend.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Auradi Bultamaka. My student registration number A1M219104. This time, I'm going to explain our material about Synchronic psycholinguistic 2 about macrostructure. Information transmission by language message. Language is the chief ingredient of the cement which holds societies together over both space and time. One of the prime goals of the student of communication is therefore an understanding of the way in which information in the colloquial sense is transmitted from one individual to another via language message. Measurement of information transfer in this sense might make use information theory. One may estimate the reduction in uncertainty of the behavior of a human destination as a function of message received from another human source. The reduction in uncertainty or increase in predictability could be expressed as so many bits of information in a mathematical sense. This approach is most applicable when the codes used by source and destination are the same, when source and destination use different and equally arbitrary codes. However, that is when we are dealing with information transfer in translation situations, new problems are introduced and information theory conception requires some extensions. Information transmission without code translation. One bit of information was defined as the amount of information needed to specify one of two classes of equally probable events. There are at least two possible modifications of which allow us to measure that amount of information transmission in a language message. These modifications are discussed and being evaluated. Information transmitted by language signals. If each two acquired probable language stimuli unequivocally elicit a different response, then each of the pair of stimuli transmit one bit of information. From this definition, it is easy to proceed to a general equation for measuring information transmission in terms of such units. Let's begin the set of language stimuli S, of which S elicits a response R, which is one set of responses SR. Let P S and PR be the probabilities of any S or R, and let P is R be the appropriate conditional probability. Furthermore, let us assume that these probabilities are unchanged throughout the period of measurement. This entire set of definitions permit us to treat language message stimuli as a set of input events. The response to the stimuli as output events and the receiver of this message as communication channels. Thus, it is possible to use the conventional measurement of information transmission, LT, which will give the average amount of information transmitted by the set. Using the symbol introduced above, LT becomes LT equals HR, 8SR. If response to the stimuli are independent of the stimuli, then HR equals 8SR so that LT equals 0. If only one response is made to each stimulus, for example, if for every S only one PSR equals 1, then HBR 0. Then HBR equals 0 and LT equals 8R and equals 8S. An example of the kind of situation to which this sort of information measurement is appropriate is that of military drill, in which language stimuli serve as stimuli for a set of eventually executed responses. In such situations, the language stimuli serve as signals in the same manner the traffic lights or the dials on the control panel serve as signals. However, many language messages do not serve as signal stimuli in the sense, but rather serve to modify behavior to stimuli rather than thus in message itself. Information transmitted by conventional language message. We can conclude that if the receivers of a message make two responses randomly to each of equiprobable stimuli before message reception, but make only one of these responses to the stimuli after message reception, then one bit of information has been transmitted by the message. Information transmission with code translation. Translation is usually regarded as a tool which is improved only by experience and good judgment on the part of translators. The development of information theory, techniques, and electronic computers has created increasing interest in both theoretical and practical problems of translation, and it may be worthwhile to analyze translation as a psycholinguistic process. Information theory provides as a general model in which the translator, whether human or machine, is treated as a channel. The foreign from language, or VL, is the input, and the translation or the language, DL, as the output. Next, what we're going to discuss is about need app or addition to information theory model. Let us first imagine machine translator between language A and B. If whenever given input state in A occurs, for example, scanning of the German word pivot, the machine reliably produces a specific output state in B, for example, prints the English word house. Conditional entropy would be 0 and information transmission would appear to be perfect, except that it could be complete gibberish. What is accomplished here is actually a translation of the foreign language into some one of near infinity of possible translation language, but not English. We would like our machine translator to produce with equal consistency the authors when pivot occurs. It is only a minimal requirement. A fundamental limitation of information theory, it has nothing to say about correspondence between the state of two systems associated in a channel. This measure information transfer would be the same and maximal for a machine which translated pivot or house, and so forth, at random as for a machine which translated pivot or horse, and so forth, as long as some specific output state was completely dependent upon each specific input state. Figure 21. Figure 21 might help to make this situation clearer as well as the kind of extension needed. We must take as given the fact that the message in two languages cannot be corresponding in any cycle sense, except for occasional contents and the like, but can be equivalent in the sense that they are associated with corresponding states in source and destination system. The particular cycle events which in the message code come to represent semantic state or non-message events are completely arbitrary. On the other hand, given the similarity of human organism and the generality of learning principles, one would expect considerable correspondence in semantic states. For example, the behaviors of both German English speakers to be the object horse may be similar, and hence the representational process associated with preferred in the one case and horse in other could be similar. In other words, equivalence of events in VL and TL is defined by correspondence of those events in source and destination which are associated with the foreign language and translation language events respectively. Input pivot is equivalent to output horse in translation because the semantic intention in the German source encoding pivot corresponds closely to the semantic significance in the English receiver decoding horse. This analysis admittedly throws the gates with wide to demon meaning with all its fuzziness and complexity. But to rule it out seems to also rule out by the definition of the center problem. Here you can see the process of the language translation from non-message event source message system or foreign language translator message system B transition language destination non-message events, and the connection about non-corresponding but potentially equivalent and potentially corresponding systems. Figure 21. Correspondence between any two systems is the proportion of the states in one that are identical with states of the other. Stability of system translator refers to the reliability which transform input states into predictable output states. Here you can see the formula where S equals 810. This measure is equivalent to that information transfer that indicates that degree to which states in transition language are predictable from state in foreign language, regardless their translation equivalence. Translation equivalent states of two message systems are thus associated with corresponding state in sources using one language and destination using other language. The rules for specifying such correspondence would of course need to be made explicit. Fidelity of system, for example translator, is the fidelity with which it transforms input states into equivalent output states. Here you can see the formula where M is any one of the states of the VL or foreign language and is any one of the states that translate language P N equals M is simply the probability of corresponding state of TL occurring with a given state M of foreign language. This is not an information theory measure and does not yield an estimate of information transfer in bits. Rather, it is a simple percentage measure, the proportion of all input events which result in equivalent output events as this has been defined. The specification of states of message system which are correlated with states and states of encoders and decoders, problem of units, establishing criteria of stability, establishing criteria of fidelity, and the treatment of non-equivalent states are all problems which arise no matter what kind of analysis of the translation process one chooses and no matter whether one deals with human or machine translation. The following discussion attempts to highlight certain of this problem but does not provide any definite answer to them. So that's all I can explain about my material. Thanks. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Afniaman. My regional number is A1M219102. I'm from group 7. Specification of states of message system. The size of units. Since the establishment of units of equivalence must be done on the basis of meaning, the choices of units to be used the describing states of the system can't be arbitrary. There might be situations in which it would be appropriate to deal with morphemic units or utterances or sequences of utterances as units. For example, the following two utterances have a correspondence of meaning even though the smaller units do not correspond. The barn door is locked. Precautions have been taken. The size of unit used in establishing correspondence may restrict the kind of operation words used to establish meaning equivalence for two morphemes might not be the same as those used in measuring equivalence for two utterances. Two simultaneous states. As soon as one attempts to establish correspondence between two utterances, it becomes clear that there may too be complex interrelations between morpheme choice, order, grammatical patterns, stress, and pitch. Establishing criteria of stability. The stability measure could be applied to the same input and different point in time, or to input as translated by different translator. In other words, it can be used either as a measure of test or retest reliability or as a measure of intercoder reliability. In either case, it is necessary to decide how large a class of events shall be considered the same event for purpose of scoring stability. For example, the same input event may result in the following output: event crimson, red, and blue. This might be considered three different events, two or perhaps even one, even in translation situation in which the alternative possible output events are arbitrarily limited. There will be a problem of degrees and kinds of meaning, which is equally sensitive to trivial and to gross difference may prove be less useful than one which takes into account semantic relations between output events. Unfortunately, although linguistic analysis may help to classify many differences, for example, in grammatical structure of two utterances, it stops short the semantic evaluation, which is necessary in order to deal with degrees of difference. Some other methods in the necessary in dealing with this problem. Among the methods which should be investigated further in this context are the following: A. Rating by speakers. This is the simple and possibly the most comprehensive method. It is known how much agreement can be reached or what the effect of various kinds of instructions of speaker X to rate differences in meaning may be. B. The semantic differential. This method has been applied to words in context, and it may prove adaptable to the problem of meaning differences between utterances, like the word association method. However, it uses a lexical item as the primary stimulus and may not be sufficiently sensitive to grammatical relations. C. Word association. One method of establishing a measure would be to have subject associate to words in a context, giving a series of associations to the same word. The association could be listed in rank order of frequency, and the list equated in left by omission of the least frequent items on the longer list. A measure of likeness in lexical meaning of two items is the proportion in
identical association given to them. Establishing criteria of fidelity. A crucial operation in establishing fidelity is actually demarking the equivalent units in input and output system. Equivalent message events have been defined as those associated with identical or at least highly similar semantic states in encoder FL and recorder TL. In order to establish such identity, there must be some common system to use for comparison. This might be called the yardstick system. In practice, the two yardstick systems used in translation are external reference and the mediating system of bilinguals. A third system might consist of non-linguistic responses to the test given by monolinguists who speak the input and output languages. A judgment of bilinguals. Asking a bilingual whether two utterances in different languages have the same meaning is a procedure which presents some problems as the rating of meaning differences by speakers of one language. B. External definition by reference. Another method would be establishing common reference through determining the range of objects and situations to which a term of set of term and refer. C. The semantic differential. If a translatable form of the semantic differential could be obtained, use cross-culturally uniform dimensions. Response to the differential might be used as a test for equivalence of meaning. D. Responses to utterances. If utterances can be constructed so that some overt response is required to them, preferably non-linguistic equivalents of respondent under comparable conditions could be considered a measure of meaning equivalence in the total utterance. This is a method which could be used to show differences in meaning arising from other sources than lack of fidelity in translation of lexical stats alone. Treatment of non-equivalent states. Assuming that one establishes equivalences between lexical elements, intonations, stress, and grammatical constructions, there will still be certain non-equivalent states left.
Om Swastiastu, my name is Putio Geratika, my student registration number is A1M21106. In this video, I will discuss Synchronic psycholinguistic II, Macrostructure, language, cognition, and culture. The relation of language to culture and cognition is of a particular concrete because of the determinative influence which a language is supposed to exert on the other two variables. The writing of Benjamin Ward and the author who has followed his example present this view in its clear forms. Also, the general thesis has a long tradition both on this, consistent with Fassbos and Edward Sapir, and in Europa from Herder von Humboldt to Ernst Cassirer, Leo Wisgeber, and Jos Stier. However, research in this area has been complemented by terminological and methodological confusion and failure to state hypotheses in a stated form. Recently, this thesis has been studied critically by several groups of interested anthropologists, linguists, and psycholinguists. The Werner Green Foundation International Symptoms and Anthropology 1997 and the Congress of Anthropology and Linguistics 1908 include the Werten-Kasong problem on their agenda, and a special congress on ethnolinguistics was held especially to consider its ramification and to develop a program of research. One common confusion, most typical of those who deal with the problem in language versus culture, is the failure to distinguish language message system external to the particular user from language as status of its user. They research terms language to the former and user the terms cognition from the latter. This comes out clearly in statements such as anything can be expressed in any language, but the structure of a given language will empower certain statements in either order. For the most part, the question has centered on the relation of a system of codification to cognition and culture, and they accordingly restrain our usage of the terms language to mean cognition. If language were to be treated as somehow independent of culture, it would be necessary to develop experimental situations that are world culture free, in which we could observe behavior. Culturally conditioned difference in motivation, personality, and so far intermediately interject themselves. The dilemma is made clear by considering the two concepts of action available. First, one may make an priori judgment that an experimental situation is culture-free, but the history of such adapt indicates that no two authorities ever agree. The secondly, one way try to demonstrate empirically that our situation is culture-free. What they mean by codification. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. What they mean by codification are all of speech behavior that are imposed on individual speakers. The rules of their language, the violation of which result in broken communication. By cognition, they mean the process of representation in language users in which are certain stimulus pattern or size comes to represent another significant stimulus partner. The behavior they mean are nothing more than these totality activities. Organization of verification, example, sorting, colored, turned into sparted files. Recognition, example, pointing to previously indicate color, patch among a large number, and so on. The human in fact enters this world at some place on its surface and finds himself among others who have certain stable way of behaving toward physical object and in some social situation, and who use a language that has a certain codification. Gradually, he learns how to behave as order learns the culture, and in doing so simultaneously develop elaborate system of cognitions ways perfecting means, association, attitude, and so forth. And also simultaneously, he learns the language associating auditory stimulus patterns with cognitions or decoding and cognitions, vocal behaviors or encoding, but according to the rules of the code. The great single field in the way of the research in this area is thus the circularity of inference. People in different cultures have different worldviews because their language is different. Example, the Hopi have different tense conceptions because their language use a different tense system. How do we know their worldviews different? Why? Because they use language differently. To escape from this tautological trap, the independent and dependent variables language structure and worldview must be independently measured. The first is independent indicators. It's possible to describe similar and differences in the codification of languages and almost completely independent of the cognitions and behaviors their user. The second is fallacy in translation methods, a method frequently used by word in order to prove that difference in worldview stem from differences in the codification is to translate some usages from one language quite literally and in most general abstract terms into other, usually English. The third is intracultural and cross-cultural designs. Intracultural design usually offer more stringent control than cross-cultural designs because of difficult in the latter case of distinctly cultural variables from codification per se. In the most general sense, world assumes that people is different culture perceive the world differently and draw his data for these associations sharply from differences in language. Illustrative experiments, both available and proposed, are described under its hypothesis. Cognition and behavior. Although not directly involved, the world view since nothing here is said about language per se. An assumption underlying all of this work is that cognitive states are determinants of our behavior, or more generally that way perceiving and conceiving the world affect behavior norms toward physical object and in social situation or culture. The reverse relation must also be stated that behavior influences cognitions, and this, in the more general form, is the notion that people in different cultures will view the world differently, quite apart from and beyond language factor per se. Hypothesis 1. The cognitive states associated with stimuli influence the respondents made to test stimuli. The independent variable here is the cognitive state, which must be indexed independently of the measurement of the offered behavior to test situation, which is the depend of variable. Cover and his co-worker have shown that the ability to solve a problem may hinge on the presence of word association. They experiment with the Meniere two-strings problem, in which two strings are suspended from the ceiling in such a manner that a subject cannot reach both strings at once. Set of semantic relations may also influence problem solving. It has been shown that certain descriptive dimensions are highly interrelated. Words like up and top are associated with light in weight, light in color, and small, while words like down and bottom are associated with heavy, dark, and large. Thus, we may think to a set of covariant dimensions up, down, top, bottom, like heavy, like dark, and small, large. Solely 100 has shown that congruence of these dimensions may facilitate problem solving and incongruence may hinder problem solving. His experimental task was the classic pyramid puzzle. Studies are intercultural, but the same or similar designs could be used cross-culturally. For example, could it be shown that the various types of solution of the Hagen-Strength problem, pendulum trying an exertion on one string, elevating oneself by standing on some subject, an edge, have significantly different frequencies for members of different cultures. Assumption that members of different cultures have somewhat different semantic structure. Examples such as that light dark is independent of down. Would their performance on solely a pyramid problem differ? A number of designs of these are possible. Hypothesis 2. The behavior entirely alleged by stimuli influences the cognitive states that comes to be associated with sites of test stimuli. This is conservative of hypothesis 1, and it raises the issue as the origin and development of cognitive process. A large number of psychologists, despite their hierarchy over mechanism, would agree that means, way of perceiving concept, and the like develop out of the matrix of behavior toward object and situations. The present hypothesis would imply that differences in language structure are not essential and that behavior cognition relation may be sufficient. Okay, that's all. My friends will continue the explanation. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Rika Sanda Dewi. My official number is A1M29108. Okay, I will continue the material about language, cognition, and culture, or cognition and behavior. The codified form of language used to talk about stimuli influence the cognition associated with the stimulus. Her independent variable is codified as is usually indexed by linguistic methods, and the independent variable is cognitive state as indexed by certain criteria behavior. Behavior criteria are usually some standard psychological measure of symbolic activity such as regression, recall, or prediction in case memory, sorting of behavior in case concept formation, assessment of stereotype or protocol events from TAT or score in case of observing attached codification variable can be in the form of relative availability of labels in the lexicon, the presence of or absence of certain grammatical feature, and so on. Intracultural approach. Language here can serve as marker to change the memory of certain characteristics of a stimulus are to differently facilitate remembering certain aspect of situation. An early study by Lehman in 1819 thought the subject could more easily distinguish between shades is gray if they had heard the numbers called more associated with them. It appears the names given to the diagram affect the reproduction of the diagram when the subject is asked to draw it later. For example, for the stimulation from two circles connected by straight line, subjects in one group were told that it could help them remember the image if they remembered the word classes, and the other group was given keyword dumbbells. Cross-cultural approach. Cross-cultural approach. Most of the anecdotal events of the well-tensioned problem is cross-cultural, but most it suffers from the methodological complication discussed earlier in the section, notably the criticality of conclusion and the use translation to prove difference in cognitive states. Much of the techniques discussed in the intracultural approach are applicable here, as are a number of additional methods that are briefly described below. The direction developed by Lineberg to study the effect of color labeling on perception on orientation is easily adapted to cross-cultural tests. The question is the extent to which color recognition can be shown to be affected by difference in color identification, different language with the experimental procedure being kept constant. The main difficulty of course is giving the experimental procedure constant. The science such as Lineberg could be used to drive possible ways in which difference in the codification of the time continuum affect cognitive states. Many other cultural objects are constant across two or more cultures despite difference in language, and this must be equally reachable in different type of cross-cultural inquiry. Will use the type of communication situation described by Carl and described elsewhere in this section. Different type of cross-cultural investigation will use this type of communication situation. So suppose the two individuals who speak the same language are placed on tables separated by screen and both have the same set of objects such as block and paste of different shape, size, and colors. One individual acts as an encoder given a certain arrangement of the material. By experimenter, he must use his language to communication the setting to another individual who acts as a decoder. Lingual individuals seem to provide an excellent basis for testing the hypothesis cross-cultural and cross-linguistic within the same individual, in some cases across language, but in the same individual who share in the same culture, in those with a bilingual combined type or are dealing with the different language system, but perhaps with a constant set of cognition with coordinate type bilinguals, and the other hand were all dealing with two distinct language system and two somewhat different cognitive and cultural system, while language plus cognition difference in the latter case may be expected result in difference in behavior in standard test situation, while the language difference themselves haven't effect in previous case. Several experiment procedures can be suggested here. Number one, the comparative use of semantic difference differential. If the semantic differential dimension can be used to be even translate methods comparing the response of linguals with monolingual speakers can be developed. One will look for a Z in linguism toward intermediate meanings and skull where there is difference between monolinguals in the two languages under certain condition, purpose, or certain type of social arrangement of a bilingual experience of interaction. There might be obstacles to this generation process in the bilingual scale might divide more sharply than the bilingual scale in the machine where differences are found across the two languages. The type word use will an important variable as explained in the following cases. A. Words that are similar in class from and phonemic from but have different graces of closeness to meaning in the two languages. For this currently different meaning, one word X minimum generation as many as would be found among homonyms in the same language, unlike French in English insensibly more like French in English in Pentics. B words that are similar in from classes in which are common translation but different in the simulation, the one might expect more generalization. The words that include different from classes has harmony with the same meaning. For example, English slave a noun and French family just a noun. She words that have the same translation in the second language. One might expect such a words to show a shift toward greater similarity for the common translation words. 2. Verbal response to non-verbal stimuli. If two languages apply labels to describe classes in domain differently, one would expect that the bilingual boundary will shift unless for citation stimuli. For example, given the spectrum limits used by English speakers for green and by French speakers for red, and might expect a shift lingualism if the ambiguous are in one language is large enough in considerable uncertain about living, and if other languages clearly include or border are under one of the labels. The boundaries of second language may define the range of physical stimuli conferred by the terms in each language. However, in highly discriminate areas without much certainty in both languages, some limits of compromise can occur. In Crow, the same term is used for situations where English will use shock and fear, and it can be translated as about. However, and might expect linguals who are asked to compare its emotional situation in Crow to differentiate in some way between two situations due to the effect the English requires it. Thematic appreciation test can also be used to explore the effect of language variation on response to constant stimuli. For bilinguals, the latent content of the TAT protocol or both lingual language will be compared with the corresponding lingual language that from such design can be used to examine variation in the response to linguals from a language to other cognition accessories with study influence in the codified form of language used to talk about the stimulus, the spreadability of levels from tears, for example, makes it more likely the language will generally have spread labels for 3 levels than Fortran as distinguished from French. Research on this superficial will require independent assessment of the criminality of a broad sample of physical and social objects and situations and the correlation of this conclusion of fact with the cross-cultural frequency of language different with labeling another profession her that the lexicon of language must be in some speak with the cultural pattern of user. Okay, I think that's for me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.